Hello and welcome back. My name is Shannon Payne, and as I've mentioned, I am the AFN liaison for personal credits. And we've been talking about personal credits in general terms with part 1 of the webinar. And in part 2 of the webinar, we talked specifically about the acknowledgement form. So now here in part 3, what we're going to do is talk about the redemption forms. And there are 2 types of redemption forms. The redemption forms that are filled out by the education entities for formal education and training, and the redemption forms that are filled out by the group educational services for cultural and language programming. So with this, in part 3, we're going to talk specifically about the group education services. So in that regard, as an overview, basically there are 4 pages to the form. And the participant fills out page 1, sections A and B, and the organization fills out the next 3 pages, section C. So the organization will fill out the contact information, the participant numbers, the budget, and the invoice. But we'll talk specifically about that as we look at the form and go through it page by page. Keep in mind that the organization must submit the redemption forms along with the checklist of supporting documentation before December 1st, 2014. Okay, so now you should have the Group Education Service redemption form in front of you. And on the very first page, it has section A, which is pre-filled and looks like a voucher. So, for example, it'll say this form is to be used by Sally Smith, this form is to be used at Blue River First Nation, this is to be used for the Blue River First Nation cultural program at a maximum value of $3,000. So there are a couple of items in that first section that are not filled out that you need to fill out. So fill out the participant's group, their language preference, and their gender. In section B, the participant has to fill out the authorization. And so this basically identifies that they agree to either share or not share their information. So it's really important to check the box on section B. Yes, I agree to share my information to process this form, or B, I do not agree to share this information. I'm recommending that you check the yes box to increase the efficiency and processing of the forms, but it's entirely up to yourself. So what the participant also has to do is then print their name, sign their name, and date it. Then they take their form to the group education service. So the group education service has to fill out the next 3 pages. So if you look at page 2, section C, part 1 at the top, it'll have the contact information. And this is the information that will be filled out by whomever is designated as the administrator or program coordinator. And so they will have to fill out their name, their title, the name of the organization, the address, phone number, etc. Then on the bottom of the form is the program information. I'm just going to pull this up. Now, the program information will be pre-filled with the name of the program and the start and the end date. This is pre-filled based on the information that was submitted in the acknowledgement form. So as I mentioned, it would be Blue River First Nation cultural program, and then the start date and the end date that was given on the acknowledgement form as an example. Now, there's something that's a little bit tricky about this form that people really need to be aware of, and that's the number of expected participants in the program and the number of participant information forms attached. So on the left-hand side, where it says number of expected participants in the program, that number is probably going to stay the same every time this redemption form is filled out. So if you have a First Nation or an organization that is going to do some programming with about 100, as an example, 100 CEP recipients, then they're expecting about 100 people to contribute and pool their money and their credits into this program. So they would put 100 as the number of expected participants. This will then correspond to the budget on the next page that I'll talk about in a moment. What I'm recommending, or what we're recommending, is that organizations and First Nations who are offering cultural programming come up with a comprehensive master budget that basically budgets for the entire number of expected participants. Now, on the right-hand side of the form at the bottom, it says number of participant information forms attached. That number will change every time the redemption form is sent in, because you will be sending in different numbers of redemption forms as they come into your organization. So for example, you may have 100 people that will be pooling their credits, but in 1 week you may only receive 15 forms. So if you're going to redeem those 15 forms at $3,000 per form, you're looking at about $45,000. So on the right-hand side, in another week when you fill out the redemption forms again, you may have a different number, so it will change. Okay, so on the next page, page 3, part 3 talks about the expenses. And it says, personal credits may be used for instructors, room rental, books, course material, program supplies, and computers, etc., to develop and deliver programs. Program supplies include those required for on-the-land activities, and we're going to go through and talk about the budget in a minute. But that means that you can you can allow for whatever program supplies and materials that you need to run your camps, to run your on-the-land activities, to get to your land for the on-the-land activities. Now this is where it's really, really important for organizations to work with their community members, because you as a CEP recipient, you need to talk to your organization or to your First Nation about how you're hoping to pool these credits so that together as a community you can coordinate your budget to make sure that everyone is clear around the expectations for how the money is going to be spent. For maximum efficiency and to decrease the administrative burden, again, as I mentioned, it's much easier to develop one budget for the organization or for the community based on a best case scenario of the number of expected participants that you anticipate will be pooling their credits for this programming. So let's talk a little bit about the sample budget. And we'll have a sample budget on the screen for this webinar so that you can look at the sample budget in more detail. And on our sample budget, what we did was we included kind of a best case scenario of all of the different examples of expenditures. So this doesn't mean that your budget has to have all of these expenditures. These are only ideas of what could be on your budget. You, your organization, your community, you will be best prepared to determine what are realistic and reasonable expenditures for your programming. But in this case, let's go through it and have a look. So we put together a section called Coordination and Administration. We know that there is a huge administrative burden with this process. And we understand that many First Nations and organizations are charging admin fees. And that is perfectly acceptable. What we are recommending, though, is that if you are charging admin fees, please let the people that you are working with, the CEP recipients, know so that it doesn't come as a surprise to them down the road. It's much the same as a college or a university would offer different admin fees just for the costs of processing their programs. So it's the same type of scenario. We have a section for instruction and resource people. And so, yes, within the context of cultural programming, you can hire whomever you like to run your programs, and you can pay instructor fees, facilitator fees. You can pay elders, you can pay recorders, you can pay your camp assistants, cooks, harvesters, security, setup, firekeepers, translators. So it's really up to you as a community how you want to allocate the instructional fees. But all of those camp roles and responsibilities are valuable, and when you're running a program, you do know that you need these resource people. Under materials and supplies, we have a number of different areas that you may want to consider for your budget. Food and cooking supplies. You can't really go out on the land and have programming without food. So that's, of course, something that would be an eligible expense. And camp tools and equipment. So, for example, generators, guns, axes, saws, knives, tanning tools, chainsaws, fishnets, traps, all of those would be certainly eligible as part of your camp supply expenses. Also, you can look at structural materials such as tents, tent frames, lumber, plywood, stoves, stovepipes. Those would be eligible as well. Other camp supplies such as sleeping bags, rain gear, mattresses, propane, tarps, all part of that whole on-the-land experience. We also included a section under materials and supplies for crafts and art supplies for people who may not necessarily be doing on-the-land activities, or who may want to do on-the-land activities but also do some traditional arts. So you may want to buy beads, needles, thread, cloth, canvas, fur, hide, sinew, scissors, any kind of materials that you would need to do sewing projects and traditional arts. You may also want to consider purchasing drums and supplies and materials to make drums, so it's really up to you. We also included a section for books and program materials, because we do recognize that there will be many communities that may choose to offer in-class sessions as well, so it's totally up to you, and those are legitimate expenses with that scenario as well. And finally, under materials and supplies, there is a section for office supplies and technology. And so, of course, any of the books, the papers that you might need, office supplies, and as well, different types of technology. So perhaps computers or cameras, the sky's the limit, as long as it's related to your cultural and educational activities. There's also a section in the budget for transportation, because it's recognized that to do on-the-land activities, you have to get out to the land. And so there is a section that allows for gas and oil purchases, and for camp vehicles. Now, we know that there won't be people really buying a lot of camp vehicles, because it probably won't make a lot of sense to buy a lot of camp vehicles, but there is certainly an opportunity for some organizations to invest in things like quads or canoes, skidoos, toboggans, boats, motors, that type of thing. And in the event that there may be people that are traveling to different events, such as powwows or ceremonial opportunities, then there is the accommodations that could be an expense as well, and also hall rentals or arbor rentals and that sort of thing. So that gives you an idea of kind of the scope of that's available to fill out your budget. So you can really start talking in your communities about what would work for you. So in the example that is given, this was for a program total of 90 participants, and so it's a $270,000 budget. So if we're talking again about our example here, the number of expected participants will remain the same, but the number of forms will change depending upon how often you submit them. And so we'll talk a little bit about the invoice process. So I want to recap. On page 1, section A and B is for the participant to fill out. If you are doing the redemption process as an organization, you have to collect all of those forms. So you need all of page 1 for each participant that you are redeeming and invoicing for. Page 2, section 3, the contact information, you only need 1 copy each time you submit your redemption forms with an invoice. Page 3, with the budget, you only need 1 copy of that each time that you submit. What I'm suggesting to save time and avoid duplicating efforts is, again, to create that master program budget that you can just say see attached and attach it to your package. And page 4, the last page, you only need 1 copy, and that has your checklist on it. So it identifies everything that you need in your submission package, in your redemption package, including an invoice. And so it's really important to make sure that you have checked all of the documentation required in your checklist, and that you've signed the declaration, and that your invoice has all of the required information, including the list of participants and the amount of money that you're invoicing for. So let's have a little look then at the sample invoice that we're including. And so this should be available on the webinar as well. And so you'll see the sample invoice has the Blue River First Nation, personal credits invoice number, whatever it is, because that'll change each time. It has the payee information, the program, the mailing address, the business registration number, and then the total amount of the invoice. The total amount of the invoice, again, correlates to the number of participant forms that you have. So if you have 3 forms for $3,000 each, then your invoice is $9,000. If you have 10 forms, then with $3,000 each, then your invoice is for $30,000. So what Crawford is going to do is they're going to look at your master budget, and they're just going to cross-reference all of the participants. So if you have your master budget of $270,000 and you send in your invoice the first time with 10 people at $30,000, they'll do $270,000 minus the 30 means that you still have $240,000 to work with as part of your budget. So that's what they're going to do to, again, streamline this process and make it more efficient. But you'll notice on the sample invoice that you have to include a list of your participants with their CEP numbers. And then that should ensure that everything runs smoothly for you. So that's the redemption process for the group educational service option. And I'm going to now answer a couple of questions that have come up around the redemption process. So one of the questions is, do I have to wait until all of the redemption forms come in before I submit them? And the answer is, you do not have to wait. And in fact, what I'm encouraging you to do as an organization is try and send in the redemption forms on a weekly basis if you can, assuming that you get a fair number to work with. Because you don't want to get bogged down with too many forms all at once. It's going to be easier for you once you've done your budget to just be very consistent in sending in your redemption forms as you start to collect the forms from the participants. Another question, can our organization invoice ahead of time for the full amount we are expecting to receive? Unfortunately, no. You will only receive the funds that are based specifically on the redemption forms that you receive at that particular time. So as I mentioned, there's a process where you collect the forms and you send them in with your invoice, but they won't allow you to invoice ahead of time. You have to actually have that copy of the participant's redemption form. Another question is, do I need to submit receipts? What we've been told by ANSI is that you do not need to submit receipts, and there is no reporting mechanism or expectation or obligation at the end of this process. However, what we are recommending is that it's really important that you as an organization or you as a First Nation working with the community, that you maintain really good business practices and that you maintain your books so that there's accountability to the people. So the CEP recipients, of course, may ask questions about how the money was spent and allocated, and you want to be able to be transparent in that regard. So we are obviously really encouraging people to use best business practices in this case and to make sure that you have those records available. So that's about it for the redemption forms, and if you want to know where to send them to, again, the mailing address and the fax number and the email address is located right on the redemption form. Thanks.